Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm the director of the Illiberalism Study Program here at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at GW. And I'm very pleased to welcome you for this online roundtable discussion of Richard Sakwa's latest book, The Lost Peace: How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. It's a really important new book that explores the reasons for the situation in which we find now, and that have a kind of broad overview of what has been happening the last 30 years and where we are moving now with the global shift in international politics and new lines of confrontation. To lead this discussion, we have with us, of course, Dr. Richard Sakwa, who is Emeritus Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent in the UK. He's one of the foremost experts on Russia and the region, and has been publishing really very, very many books, among them Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War, Frontline Ukraine, and many, many great books on Russia. And as discussant, we have with us Nikolai Petro, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Rhode Island and also a Senior Washington Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. He has been publishing also largely on the region, was at the Council, had a Council of Foreign Relations Fellowship and several important publications, including also a fellowship with the Kennan Institute. And then Paul Grenier, who is an essayist and translator, president of the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy, and an editor of Landmark, a journal of international dialogue. His work have appeared in American Affairs, The National Interest, Telos, The American Conservative, and so on. So to begin, I would like to give the floor first to Richard for kind of summarizing the main arguments and findings of his book. And then I will give the floor to Nikolai and Paul for some comments, then give the floor back to Richard for a discussion, and then we will have time at the end for a Q&A session. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for what will be a fascinating discussion. And Richard, I'm giving you the floor.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And it's marvelous to be with you, if only virtually today. We're scattered all over the world, but discussing indeed global issues. So the topic is the book, The Lost Peace: How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. And I'll just make some comments at the moment. And the first one is the question about why the book and why I decided to do it. My goal was to start a debate, first of all, analytically, how we got into the mess, how we managed to jump from one Cold War to the next almost seamlessly, and indeed, one has to say, almost unreflexively and almost even unconsciously. And the big, if you like, the meta question underlying the book and underlying the research is that fundamental question: is peace possible? Is a more cooperative global order possible? And if so, well, how do we get there? And in my view, if it is possible, then how to get there requires analysis, accurate analysis, a type of conceptual framework. In the good old days, this vision of a more peaceful order was embedded in all sorts of social movements. For example, good old-fashioned socialist movements, trade union movements, all believed in elements of development that, individual citizens, and if societies themselves work together, then a more stable, coherent peace order on a global level would be possible. That is the fundamental principle, if you like, of socialist internationalism. That's very a weak, I mean, it hasn't disappeared by any means, but it's a weak tendency today. There's church movements, other peace movements also believe this. But the fundamental view, as I shall explain a bit more in a minute, is the aspiration of the system established in 1945, what we call the Charter International System, based in particular on the United Nations, but more broad than that. On its basis, there's a whole stack of international law of normative legislation. Of course, the Genocide Convention of 1948, the same year, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But as I say, the meta idea is that 1945 was a moment in which the world, coming out from the most disastrous war that humanity had hitherto seen, really felt that, never again, not just genocide, but this type of war to be avoided. Unfortunately, as we know, never again tends to mean endless repetition. So that's, as it were, the underlying, normative framework for the book, the meta-political underlying idea. And of course, this idea of a possible more cooperative peace order emerged again at the end of the First Cold War between 1989 and 91. So that's the big picture. The second one, just a couple of words. I know how much people love methodology. So I'll just say, on how do we study that? Of course, there's all sorts of appeals and normative frameworks out there. What, in a scholarly manner, what I've tried to do is to apply the basic idea of interpretivism. That is, looking at what people said and then trying to analyze actions, reactions, and how a dynamic situation develops. There's other ways of describing that methodology, but to looking at the text, the normative text, that's the, for example, the Helsinki Final Act, going all the way back, the Atlantic Charter of August 1941, and such like, as well, of course, as speeches and secondary documentation. So that's the framework. What's the substance? As I mentioned, I argue that we need to distinguish between the international system and international politics. This is a distinction that, for example, Henry Kissinger in his book on diplomacy famously failed to make. And so many people today, when they talk about world order, it's not quite clear, well, it's never clear to me, certainly, what they mean by this. We have an international system. The one we have today builds on the failures and achievements of the earlier one. So the 1945 system learned from the failures of the Versailles system of 1919, which in turn built on the Congress system, Vienna system of 1815, and then on the Utrecht system at the beginning of the 18th century, which put international law firmly on the agenda, all the way back to the first of the major European modern international systems, the Westphalian system, which put the state at the center of things. The difference about this final version, the 1945 system, is that it's based on a very articulated, even though they didn't use the term, vision of sovereign internationalism. States would be the basic actor in international politics, but there is a robust framework for internationalism, no longer, incorporating some of the old socialist internationalist ideas and other visions of cooperative order. So this sovereign internationalism is a mode of engagement in international politics. Then, of course, at the second level, we have international politics itself. And within that second order, if you like, international politics, we have competing blocks, world order, visions of world order. The ones which contested during the First Cold War were obviously the US-led Western order, and on the other side, the Soviet Union and its communist bloc of Soviet states. So, and of course, a third world led, certainly in its proclaimed sense, by China. So we have an international system, and we have within that the dynamic combinations of within international politics. I mean, I won't go into it now, but of course, we could identify a third level. Of course, there is a third level, and that is international political economy, which some people in the age of globalization prioritized, in which basically argued that globalization, that third level of international political economy, I'm not putting them hierarchically, by the way. It's just saying that there are these different levels to the analysis of international affairs. So you have international political economy, transnational corporations, and of course, a fourth important component is transnational international civil society, human rights movements, the Red Cross, all sorts of Helsinki bodies, also environmental bodies, of course, as well. But that's another issue. So we have this Charter International System, and it's the framework for international politics. We have the Charter system incorporated and was a way of managing great power politics. It was, and it presents a way of overcoming that dilemma which Paul identified just recently in talking about that the Simone Weil journal is on Substack, when you talk about with John Mearsheimer, the tragedy of great power politics, that states act according to their position to maintain security in a basically an anarchical system. But the more that they try to ensure their own security, the more they alarm others, and thus end up in a competitive dynamic. The whole point of this international system idea, putting it right at the center, is that it tempers, it moderates, and it offers an escape route out of this endlessly competitive model of international politics. And so by ignoring that thing, of course, hardline realists would say that multilateral institutions and all of the associated practices of diplomacy, of dialogue, of people-to-people contact means nothing. Well, the meta-politics of my book suggests it is actually important that this a different mode of engaging in international politics, and it expresses the deepest aspirations of those who established the UN system in 1945, and indeed of vast swathes of society, global society today. I know that even in our local environment in Southeast England today and all over the world, it is quite clear that a peace and development agenda is to be recreated or found somewhere or another. Unfortunately, we had that after the end of the Cold War, two models of this peace order developed. We had I'm cutting some bits out. We had those who developed a vision of sovereign internationalism, which was the idea that with the end of the ideological divisions of the Cold War, the struggle of communism versus capitalism, that UN-based system and that model of politics could come into its own. Well, that didn't come about because something intervened, and it was an implicit part of the system which emerged after 1945. And at this point, I'll suggest that we had this model of sovereign internationalism was challenged by what I'm now calling in the West, two political orders contest even to this day. There is the model which Eikenberry and others stress of liberal international order. This was the model of free trade, of democracy, freedom, as defended and interpreted by Washington during the Cold War and afterwards. And of course, after 1989, this order became global with globalization and everything else. However, there is a double bottom to this Western order, and this is what ultimately this trap led to this conflict to which we have today. This liberal international order, in its European context, was stressing, Europe whole and free, but it was contrasted by that second facet, the second face to the West, which I'm more and more nowadays defining as the political West. In the United States, it took the form of a Trumanite state, the national security state, and all of its ideological attendants in the neocon movement and of liberal and humanitarian internationalists, liberal internationalists. This militant, even messianic vision of the world is the other facet of the West. So we have this political West, which in the US took the form of the Trumanite state. Globally, it appeals to American exceptionalism and forms of hegemony. For liberals, it's a liberal hegemony. For others, it's a more robust form of dominance. But it's out there. But which in the post-Cold War years took the form of a type of democratic internationalism. And of course, it subverted the very idea of the peace dividend. It subverted the idea of a genuine cooperative order, because it assumed with that end of history ideology that there could be no alternative, that the whole ideology of the end of history, the human evolution, had achieved a certain point in which a maximum point. Anybody who fights against it is not just mistaken, but ultimately evil. And this sort of division of the world uh, generated all sorts of tensions, which but it undermines the fundamental principles of sovereign internationalism. In other words, this political West, the two sides of it, that's the LIO, which lately calls itself the rules-based order, and this more robust political West, its military arm, NATO, and its associated bodies, and of course the huge plethora of think tanks in Washington and London and elsewhere. So this huge ideological military complex clearly has effectively usurped the privileges of that charter international system. It claims to be able to interpret it and to substitute for that what was an achievement of all of humanity in establishing the UN system and the charter system in 1945. So we have this tension, and of course Russia was caught in the crosshairs of this. It was, and Gorbachev, when he put an end to the Cold War, was very happy to appeal to the Charter international system. When Moscow and the Soviet Union and Gorbachev gave up the Cold War in the late 1980s, it was never a capitulation to the West. It was an acceptance of the achievements of the West, in particular the liberal international order. But at no point did anyone suggest that in Moscow that it would be, apart from some extreme liberals, a capitulation to the political form of the West, that political West. And so it was a fundamental, duality in the way that the Cold War ended, which was, imminent or implicit all the way since 1945. And so Russia becomes excluded. And of course, the I've got a pop-up comes up, very annoying, cancel it. Yeah. So it was a problem of that Russia wanted to join a liberal international order, an impartial one, based on the UN principles, but it was never going to accept a defeated status. And of course, that applies today to China. And so those expectations that it would, as Robert Zelek and others would say, that it would, as it were, become a stakeholder in the existing system. What system? This is where vague definitions of world order become so dangerous, because it was clearly China considers itself a founder member of the charter system. And so in that context, it expects and takes on the responsibilities. It does not consider itself a subaltern element in a liberal international order led by the US, let alone a political West in all of its security implications. So this is one of the fundamental frameworks of the book, and it then follows through with detailed studies of European Union, of developments in the US, the emergence of the global South, which is challenging. The global South is quite firmly defending sovereign internationalism. We saw that in the declarations of the non-aligned movement in Kampala just a few days ago. Over 100 states were involved, a group of 77, which is now about 140 odd states, gave this declaration, a resounding defense of the autonomy of the Charter international system. So in that context, this isn't, it's false to see it as anti-West or anything like this. It's simply pro that universalism, which Gorbachev and the Soviet Union appealed to in 1989, which successive Russian leaders have also appealed to. So that's a framework. Of course, this all has come to a head over the failure of the European security order to take shape. And of course, we've ended up in the worst possible way in a second Cold War, which, and this is my final point, this second Cold War is far more deep, pervasive, but at the same time amorphous than that first Cold War. The first one clearly was about clearly demarcated lines: communism versus capitalism, Soviet Union versus the US and its allies. Today, what is this war fighting about? Democracy versus autocracy is a very shallow and misleading way of understanding it. But if my book has any value, it does provide, I think, a different terminology and a different conceptual framework in which we can conceptualize and thus provide some analytical framework, not only for the situation in which we find ourselves, but a way out. And as far as I can see, the only way out is the consolidation and confirmation of those principles and its body of international law based on the charter system of 1945. There is no alternative system waiting in the wings, no alternative ideas, no alternative frameworks. We have to live with it. We have to make it work. Of course, it can be reformed, and it needs to be reformed, but not. Unfortunately, of course, the United Nations has become today an arena for conflict and not a forum for its resolution. But that doesn't mean abandoning it. So I'll stop there. So I look forward to discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this great summary of the key conceptual element of your book. And I would like to give the floor to Nikolai first and then to Paul after.
Thank you. I shall be brief. This book is meticulously documented. Just as importantly, it is full of insightful references that are meaningfully connected. And by highlighting these connections, Richard reveals the pathological patterns that have developed, particularly within US foreign policy over the past 3 decades. That pathology is manifest in policies that are now undermining the very world order that preserved the peace among great powers after World War II, and that eventually led to the collapse of communism in the USSR. Pursuant to that collapse, a bold new approach should have been adopted toward the former Soviet Union, and first and foremost toward Russia. Instead, due to a stunning lack of vision and lack of faith in the Russian people, the choice was made to exploit their momentary weakness for the West's unilateral advantage. Unilateralism received broad bipartisan support in the United States because it was presented differently to different constituencies. It was portrayed to liberals as an opportunity to expand democracy, identified as subordination to American interests. It was portrayed to realists as preventing chaos in the aftermath of the collapse of Soviet power. It is telling, however, that whenever there was a conflict between unbounded imperialism and self-restraint, in such policy areas as free trade, human rights, and Russian membership in international institutions, the liberal logic of inclusivity always gave way to the imperial logic of guaranteeing American supremacy. All of this is carefully diagrammed in Richard's book through the dichotomous discussion of the charter system based on the primacy in international relations of the sovereignty of states, and the liberal international order based on the primacy of very specific American values, and therefore contemptuous of any constraints on those values. Since I find his description of this dichotomy and the dangers it poses quite convincing, I will instead focus on the solutions that Richard proposes, which I find less convincing. As I understand it, Richard still holds out the hope for a revival of the charter system and its ability to incorporate liberal values. It seems to me, however, that the charter system and the liberal order have been in direct competition for quite some time and are, at this point, mutually exclusive. The problem, as Richard properly points out, lies in the illiberalism of the modern American liberal order. It tolerates no meaningful dissent. A system of sovereign nation states, by contrast, presumes not only the ability to disagree with other value systems, but for that choice to be respected by all. I see no way to split the difference on this point. It is a foundational assumption of sovereign internationalism. And that is certainly how NATO leaders and Russian leaders see it. Each party is fighting for the right to define the future of humanity. The suffering caused along the way, regarded by both as collateral damage in a just cause. Now, Richard does suggest that a gestalt switch may be a way forward. To summarize, first, recognize the complexity of international relations. Second, look for pathways to peace within current structures. And third, he says, recognize the legitimate interests of other states. But isn't the problem fundamentally that the liberal order is not equipped for this? It cannot embrace complexity because it associates complexity with paralysis. It does not work through current global structures because the latter are not committed to liberal values. Finally, it cannot recognize the interests of other states as legitimate because any state that opposes Western values is illegitimate by definition. Is it not, therefore, a false hope to suggest, as Richard does, that liberal domestic transformation can be extended into a broader liberal peace among nations and somehow be, quote, integrated into the charter system? How can it, when, as Richard himself points out, quote, liberal hegemony repudiates the very notion of balance of power, end quote. I too hope for the ultimate triumph of liberalism, by which I mean the values of classical 19th century liberalism, not today's militarized liberal imperialism. I fear, however, that the current civil war in the West over the proper nature of liberalism, one universalist and intolerant of diversity, the other regionally based and far more accepting of regional diversity than it is of individual diversity. This civil war is only just beginning. I therefore see little evidence of the capacity for self-correction and self-restraint in the current liberal order. Those who are waiting for the wisdom of restraint to dawn upon our political leaders will, I fear, be living in darkness forever. If the remnants of classical liberalism do survive, it will be because it will have been preserved by those who currently stand outside the self-professed, rules-based liberal order. And if a salutary balance in international relations is someday reinstated among the great powers, I suspect that it will be imposed by China and its allies upon the West, just as it was imposed by the Soviet Union upon the West after the Second World War. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nikolai, for these comments. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks, thank you, Marilyn. And so both of your comments actually are a nice segue into some of the things that I wanted to talk about. Having read your book, Richard, which I greatly enjoyed and learned a lot from. It was the kind of historical and institutional analysis that I'm utterly incapable of, and so it's very useful for people who like to deal in sort of abstractions and so forth. And sometimes don't get enough into the nitty-gritty of sort of the historical development and institutional development of problems. But without that kind of getting into the nitty-gritty, there's no way to solve things. The world doesn't work based on abstractions. But abstractions are still needed, and I agree with you that the theoretical component and methodological aspects are interesting and important. Richard, you mentioned that you point out something that I know that Colonel Doug McGregor often points out in his frequent speeches on the internet, that there's no ideological conflict. So what's this all about? And then you also point to the political West dominated by sort of the neocon sort of project of constant expansion as another causal force in the background of what's going on. And what's striking about that aspect that you point out, which is similar to something that Nikolai Petro just pointed out, is precisely this absence of restraint. And the unifying idea of the comments I want to make is that the political order that we're living in the ideological West, the sort of the power political dynamic of sort of matter and force and mass and so forth that people like Mearsheimer are comfortable with, that whole order on the one hand, as well as our sort of the values and ideas and ideal order that animates the West, sort of the form and the content, neither of them have within them any intrinsic idea of limit. And to me, that's sort of like the overarching problem that we're facing, which goes sort of, if you looked at, sort of from the meaningful content of the order that we're living in. So if you think about, what are the causes of the conflict or the causes of the loss of the peace, I think that therefore I like to think of in terms of methodologically separating out sort of the material power component of the loss of sort of the growth of conflict, and then the values aspect, the values incompatibility aspect. And both are developed in your book clearly and very well. And it's not surprising that John Mearsheimer praised your book, because that power political dynamic that he's feels comfortable with is developed very nicely and convincingly, I think, in your book, including there's a section where you quote from Michael McFaul, who makes the classic sort of democratic peace theory explanation of why the war started, because there's a lack of democratic values inside of Russia, and so therefore the Russian leadership needs to have an external enemy to consolidate power at home, because otherwise it's lacking in legitimacy, which can only come from democratic values such as we have in the West. But then you very nicely point out that a democratic Russia, even a perfectly democratic Russia, would still defend its interests and sovereignty in the world of competing nation states, sort of classic sort of realist positioning of the realities. And that's well supported both in your book and of course in reality by the fact that Yeltsin, who was he and his team were fully on board with the Western liberal values order, but were very frustrated that the CSCE never was even seriously considered as a replacement for NATO. And whereas the CSCE, of course, including Russia, NATO not, and NATO continuing to refuse to include Russia despite its obvious interest in being included in it. And of course, so there's that whole dynamic. And so what's striking, I think, and explanatory is that for quite a long time, up until 2005, 6, 7 at least, even under Putin, Russia was still very much thinking itself ideologically as being within the Western world, and its political philosophers were thinking that way. But actions by the West in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Iraq, all helped serve to undermine its confidence that not only that being outside of that order, not accepting that order, was somehow safe, and they could simply drift along and not take any actions to secure their own interests. So to me, that supports. So that I think that side of your causal argument, though, could be even further strengthened than it is in the book in a couple of ways. first thing that came to my mind while I was reading that or thinking about that aspect of your book, Richard, was the interview, which I think is given too little attention, by George Friedman, the president and founder of Stratfor, which it is often described as kind of like a private CIA. It's an intelligence outfit, which with Friedman clearly having very deep ties and sort of access to people in the national security institutions in the United States, and so forth. And he gave this fascinating interview to Kommersant, the Russian commercial newspaper, so like the Russian Wall Street Journal, in December of 2014. After, of course, the Maidan events had already happened, and after things had already kind of, the sanctions had been initiated, and it was clear that things were going to be really bad for a long time. And he makes the point that Russia sort of got into the doghouse with the United States, so to speak, not because its values were not nice enough. He doesn't mention values at any point. It's a purely power political analysis that he makes, that Russia was interfering in America's plans in Syria. This made people upset, that Russia was not sitting in its box and minding its own business. It was getting in the way of America's plans for removing Assad in Syria. This meant, and he literally says, Russia had become a problem. But the West the United States didn't want to confront Russia militarily directly in Syria. So it looked for a way laterally to do something that would make Russia realize that it's opposing America's expansive interests could not happen without cost. And what does Russia want least of all? Least of all, it wants a Ukraine that's unstable and that's falling out of its orbit. And so that's precisely that the decision was made to destabilize Ukraine and to cause problems for the United States in Ukraine. And I think it's worth rereading. It's easy to find this interview, but just to give you a flavor of it, the United States, says Friedman, saw that Russia was on the rise and sought to prevent it from consolidating its positions in the post-Soviet space. The success of pro-Western forces in Ukraine would make it possible to contain Russia. Russia calls the events the coup d'etat organized by the United States. He calls the events at the beginning of the year a coup d'etat organized by the United States. Parenthetically, I'll say I understand that that's still a controversial framing of it in many circles. But according to Friedman, writing in 2014, he says it really was the most blatant coup in history. So he describes it in purely power political terms. But now let's, if I have a few more minutes, Marlene, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about the sort of ideational, civilizational aspect. To what extent was this incompatibility of values causal for the loss of the peace?
Yeah, let's do that. Just a few more minutes. Yeah.
With just a few more minutes, Marlene? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll try to wrap it up. But you mentioned that the argument about Russia being willing to sacrifice its sovereignty. If it had been willing to sacrifice its sovereignty and focus on domestic development, Russia could potentially have won from that bargain materially, because it would have become part of a dynamic order in the West, a dynamic and innovative system, as you put it, that could have been to Russia's material benefit, and that by challenging the Western order and insisting on its sovereignty, it may have made, I quote from you in the book, a mistake of historic proportions. Of course, if it loses in this standoff, that will end up being proven correct. But since you brought up Henry Kissinger in the connection of how you go about solving international, about setting up an international order after a period of chaos, such as we're currently living through. This gets back to why would Russia insist on at great cost potentially to itself on its sovereignty? And I looked up in Kissinger's book on the reestablishment of the European order after the Napoleonic Wars. It's actually, I think it's his best book from 1957, A World Restored. And this is an interesting quote from Kissinger, given that he's a realist. He says, no power will submit to a settlement, however well balanced and however allegedly secure, which seems totally to deny its vision of itself. And this is where I think if there were more, for time, we can discuss this in more detail, Richard and Nikolai, but to what extent liberalism as it is today is compatible with Russia as it conceives what it is today. And I think that I might have, if I have any differences with your approach, Richard, I think it might be in this dimension, because the values order in the West today seems to hinge on the West in the United States specifically having the right to define what is properly modern, what is properly progressive, and whether states are on the right point of the timeline of progress. And if they're 10 years behind the West, then that's not good enough. So like the browbeating of states like Hungary and Poland and so forth are because they're not sufficient, they're not modern in the right way at the right time. And in the United States is the country that has the authority to make those determinations. But just to conclude, I'd encourage, thank you for mentioning Landmarks, which is now on Substack of the Simone Weil Center's publications page. We've been publishing a slew of papers by Russian intellectuals, including the one that's very apropos to this discussion by Chadaev. I think it's Alexei Chadaev, prominent public intellectual in Russia that I learned about from our friend Paul Robinson. And he specifically drills down on this point that we will, thank you very much, we'll define our own modernity. We have our own resources, our own history, our own approach to human anthropology and faith, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need America to define for us what it means to be modern. But anyway, I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for your great comment. Richard, I want to give you the floor back for some discussion with Nikolai and Paul's comments.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much, and thank you both for excellent comments. I've really enjoyed and learnt from them. To address, the bigger issue across both, the first thing to say, I suppose, is that the post-war system, international system, has matured. That we now have some 200 states, 193 in the United Nations, and that the historical epoch has moved on. Not just from the first Cold War to Cold Peace and today, it's just a more the way that Russians and possibly Chinese talk about it is multipolarity, but we need to conceptualize even what that means. If it just simply means the same old in new forms, that's not particularly helpful. Multipolarity, in my attempt to understand it, means that the system really has matured, that the post-colonial, the old colonies have gone, that the states like Indonesia, Mexico, obviously India, and of course China, but a slightly different way, and so many other states in Africa, we've seen leadership, even a sort of statements made at the non-aligned movement in conference in Kampala over the last few days by Yoweri Museveni has been fascinating, addressing almost Paul's final point, that ultimately, who's to tell us how to live? Certainly no longer the West. It's no longer the arbiter and determiner. It cannot be in this multipolar world. But, multipolarity is only halfway analysis point, because if my model of an international system being the overarching framework, and within it we have different models of world order, different value systems, regional orders, then of course there's nothing incompatible about it. And the fact that the 54 states of Africa are all, gradually asserting themselves in the best sense of the word, in, as we saw in the South African launching of the International Court of Justice case against Israel just recently. That wouldn't have happened in the first Cold War, and it's a sign that that, if you like, Russia, China, and so on are part of the wave of the future. And at the same time, it is, as Paul just mentioned, a fundamental debate about models of modernity. And of course, in sociology, there's been this fascinating debate over many years over multiple modernities or just one. Of course, there are certain common features to any modern system. And it's those common features, going back to Nikolai's point, which I stress, that those values embedded in the charter system, yes, many of them are liberal, but at the same time, they're tempered by I was, Nikolai's written about the tragedy of Ukraine, and Robert Kaplan, that tragic element of politics, which is understanding the limits, because, of course, in the debates over the foundation of the United Nations, there were certain maximalist ideas, but ultimately some of them were tempered. And the system which has emerged is a compromise, and its compromise was on precisely that ground that it is not a wholly liberal. It is precisely based on a state-based sovereign internationalism, where states choose when and how to work together, but within that framework of what, and this was the big debate in 1945, why human rights had to wait effectively until 1948 for the Universal Declaration, was precisely the way to try to separate some of these enormous value debates out from international politics, and to let's just focus on making sovereign internationalism work. And therefore, at its core ideal is, if you like, human values rather than liberal values. And I think we can distinguish a little bit between the two. And that's why today there's things. Obviously, China, Russia, and so many other states observe it in the breach. But, and of course, we too. So that's a problem. I mean, just to focus specifically on Nikolai's points, I very much like your characterization of pathological patterns. That's absolutely the case. And unfortunately, these pathological elements, which were, part of this double bottom to the West, and of course we see it in CIA coups, 54 at the last count since the Second World War, endless interventions, all of that sort of stuff. And of course, after 1989, it was radicalized and universalized in the absence of a Soviet Union. And coming back to Paul's point, that ultimately the emergence of a, if you want to call it a multipolar world, is actually salutary for the political West itself. Because going to your point about Nikolai's point about the absence of restraints, I think that's an excellent way of looking at things. We can see it today, of course, and I've just wrote this morning a little bit. For example, the United Kingdom is a marvelous example of it. British politics today. There are no limits to its, if you like, pushing the escalator up the hill of the Third World War. With this recent security treaty with Ukraine, which the British, which Grant Shapps and Rishi Sunak say will last 100 years. Well, even just the idea of framing it in that way is so astonishing, so limitless, so lacking self-perception that, it's absolutely right, this restraint. But restraint in international politics comes when it meets a countervailing force. And that was one reasons why, of course, the first Cold War ultimately why we survived the first Cold War, and why we may not survive this second Cold War, is because at the moment there is no formalized sense of restraint being forced by a coalition or an alignment. And apart from, of course, the emerging alignment of Russia and China and the emerging associations like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and of course 5 new members joined and joining from the 1st of January this year. So we're beginning to see this counterbalance. So you're absolutely right, the lack of restraint, but it's being, of course, will the leaders in Washington and London and the European Union, of course, which has joined the political West with full militancy, with all the flags and guns blazing, with under the Commission, the present European Commission at the present time, no real attempt to establish a peace agenda in the European Union, and it's now fully, and its members as well have now fully endorsed, apart from Hungary and Slovakia, the militant agenda. So you're absolutely right. The imperial logic of US interests. Because we don't have much time, when you talk about the solutions, I accept your criticisms. Yes, that one could be often accused of idealism of the sort that E.H. Carr excoriated in his marvelous book 20 Years Crisis in the interwar years, where the idealists caused more trouble than the realists, he said. But don't forget that E.H. Carr, even despite his rather harsh realism in that book, or realistic view of things, always tempered his criticism with a profound normative element in his work, in which he did say, and he did talk about, patterns and pathways to peace. And, ultimately didn't use the terms. It was based on this sort of respect for sovereign internationalism. And you can never, the values level will never entirely disappear, because on what basis? If it was just pure self-interest, then how will we deal with those challenges, common challenges facing humanity? It's all sorts of issues, from environment to development to health, pandemics, we've just had one, and so much more. So, I mean, while I, accept your criticisms that, we could make these jumps, ultimately we're talking about a sovereign peace order, which can challenge possibly the unrestrained ambitions of the political West today. And coming back to Paul's point, it's ultimately we even, and Russia of course is very much part of that, is how do we find within our context a better West? And it's there. We can see it. The fact that we're talking today in the way we are is almost a sign that we're a community, and the Simone Weil Center is a marvelous expression of it. That an understanding that there are communities, and so to be anti-Western is almost meaningless, because what we're saying is when we're anti-imperialist, we're anti-colonialist, dominant. But within the West itself, there is this potential, and if by exposing the militarism and the dangers of avoiding the electoral process of the ability to make meaningful change, and that goes across the globe, by the way, today, is this voiding, and what Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, of the weightlessness, where words mean nothing, but words do mean something, and we have a responsibility as intellectuals to challenge, technocratic managerialism and so on and so forth, to try to reconstitute, or if you like, disinter those principles which were voiced so eloquently in 1945, and of course, and in 1989, and the end of the Cold War, but which have now been forgotten. I just don't find, but you're right, they may or may not work. It may or may not work, but we how to find it. And one way of doing this, just my final point, is to divide the West today, not just in the complex, the analytical point, but more historically, to say that today, in looking for this better West, we can identify 3 Wests. There's this political West, this beast which was established after 1945, but within it there's many, the other double bottom, the that internationalism, which is still there. But then we can talk about the civilizational West, that 500-year dominance of the civilizational West. Sergei Karaganov in Russia talks about this, that this whole 500, but it isn't just now. I think that the war in Southwest Asia and Palestine today shows that, this is a 500-year trajectory where we find ourselves today, of the dominance of a civilizational West, its huge achievements, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and even though, of course, both of them deeply contradictory, but at the same time, the age of colonialism, Western dominance, and so on is coming to an end. The Russians are not alone in suggesting this. The non-aligned movement has been saying this for a long time. But then there's a deeper West, that is that cultural West, which, of course, from its very inception, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, was precisely international. It wasn't just sort of Greco-Roman or even Judeo-Christian. If you look at those early years, deeply interacting with the cultures of China and above all of the Indus Valley. It wasn't called those things in those days, but there were interactions and cultural interactions going along, almost a type of proto-globalization. And that cultural West is the better West, which I think is my certain ambition to try to put at the forefront today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this insight, Richard. A great contribution to the global discussion. We now have about half an hour for Q&A, and there are several, as you can imagine, a lot of questions arriving in the chat. I will try to organize them around some kind of key topic. Maybe one that, in fact, is following what you were just saying, Richard. One question from one of our colleagues about how the current narrative that framed the conflict very much as a kind of East-West conflict with democracy coming from the West, marching toward the East, and the East resisting to democracy. How does that collide or interact with the North-South conception of the war that would more take into account the kind of colonial experience? So how would you see this articulation of an East-West conflict and a North-South one? And could you elaborate on the place of the global South in the current conflict? So it's really following what you were kind of just saying. And do they have any weight on that? I'm sorry for the noise in the background. My daughter is participating in the discussion. Richard, I give you the floor for that.
Good to see she's keen to take part in it. Yeah. Exactly. There's so many ways of cutting the cake, but at the moment we can say that this conflict in Europe is the global North at it again. There's so many comments from leaders across the globe, above all articulated most eloquently today by Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister, in his book, The India Way, I think it's called. Very, very important. And of course, in Singapore, the Singaporean diplomat Mahbubani and others. What we have is the Europe, but the global North in general, engaging effectively in its own little mini Third World War to continue the agenda which wasn't resolved in the First World War, the Second World War. All those passions, all those frameworks have re-emerged. You close your eyes and you'd think it's 1914, not 1938, and because it's not always 1938, which seems to be the image, with appeasement and the comparisons with Nazi Germany. It's always 1914 in the global North. This battle of old-fashioned militaristic states for dominance and for privilege and the right to exploit the global South, all of that. So this is why the global South, so many comments now, are looking with contempt for the West. This the West as in the political West, and of course Russia and those participants and all those countries in between, Ukraine and the Baltic republics and Poland, none of them were able after 1989 to really transcend and to engage in that transformative politics which was available, instead of which the end, and of course I very much maybe it's not because I've become Brexitified, by being outside the European Union, but leaving aside its, commercial and other and human positive aspects. But on a purely geopolitical level, the European Union has exacerbated these conflicts rather than resolving it. What happened with the Global West, European Union and NATO is that they incorporated all the, quite legitimate security concerns of the former communist states and then amplified them. Then, of course, it was these revanchist or angry sentiments were then given formal legitimate status in various resolutions of European Parliament. The attempt to rewrite 20th century history has, of course, then fed into the conflicts of the 21st century. We weren't, so in other words, after 1989, it was precisely that lost peace was a very deeply flawed one. But you're absolutely right. The Global South wants nothing to do with it. The system has matured. They, for example, the ASEAN countries, they talk about the ASEAN spirit of cooperation. It doesn't work perfectly, of course, but nevertheless, it stands in stark contrast to the endless, jockeying for position, for power and status of the global North states and its institutions. It just reminds me of an important point that Paul made, which is the fact that after 1989, there was almost no institutional or even ideational innovation, the OSCE and such like, instead of which it was the political West that took shape in the Cold War, then claimed to be both universal and exclusive. There was no room for anyone else. And of course, that wasn't going to go down well in Moscow and many other places. So, no, indeed, this is, the hour of the Global South. And more than that, maybe we can now learn. In fact, we should, as I say, from ASEAN, and so many fine diplomats making their points in UN General Assembly debates and so on. So, I'm very positive from that point, and that goes to Nikolai's earlier point about sources of innovation or sources of transformation of the way that international politics is conducted within that framework of charter system, which isn't just liberalism. It's about it's about peace, development, and cooperation.
Thank you, Richard. And of course, if Nikolai and Paul wants to intervene, please feel free to comment also. We have another question which asks, so in your book, you are mentioning that it's time to envision a new security architecture for Eastern Europe, proposing kind of permanent non-alignment for countries that are bordering Russia. And so the question is that how can this be justified both in practice and ethically, knowing that these countries are not interested in being non-aligned, but wants to join NATO. So how do you envision, or how do we envision kind of talking with Eastern European countries about non-alignment if it's going against their own wishes?
Yes, I think at that thing I was quoting somebody's idea on this, which was a very powerful one, and it may have averted things earlier on if we had to, but it raises the absolutely legitimate question about the choice of, if they want to join NATO, why shouldn't they? Well, we know why, of course, today, but my argument from the very beginning was a slightly different one, and that was that the reason why these countries want to join NATO, because that's the only thing on the agenda. If the OSCE or some other body had emerged, then of course there wouldn't be any need for just NATO. Whereas if it was just simply the enlargement of the political West, of course these countries, Poland and the Baltic republics, would want to join what is a both normatively powerful and militarily successful, if you like, body, though wars in Afghanistan and so on were far from successful. So it's understandable. The key point was, and I quote it, it goes all the way back, that after 1989, we should have developed a stronger pan-continental European vision. of pan-continental security in which all those countries in between, and they wouldn't be in between, they you know, in the 90s, I used to joke that the headquarters of our institutions in, for example, European Union and indeed NATO, should move to Warsaw, because Warsaw is equidistant between London and Moscow. And so instead of being, you know, the lands in between, it would become the new center of this pan-continental vision of security. Of course, if everything was displaced and focused on Washington, that would become meaningless, and it has done. So, you know, even such a passionate advocate of NATO enlargement as Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997, in his book on the Grand Chessboard, he argued there should be an overarching security body which includes Russia, because he understood the dangers of excluding it. And even way back in 1994, if you look at the documents from the Clinton archive and 1994, that first document, which absolutely explicitly talked about Ukraine joining NATO, it also said, one of the paragraphs in that document recently desecretified or made open, it actually says we need some special relationship with Moscow, a special framework. But of course, those, you know, the Permanent Joint Council and NATO-Russia Council were absolute mere shadows of a substantive, inclusive security architecture. So, then the question, you know, in other words, that idea of Warsaw, etc., wants to join NATO. We wanted, and we should have, and a lot of people were saying it at the time, well, we need to create a framework in which joining NATO becomes part of a positive peace agenda, which means we don't, it isn't exclusive, because NATO enlargement in and of itself may have been a good thing. It may have been in Russia's interest even to stop the smaller countries fighting each other and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Another question that maybe relates also to something you were mentioning earlier, and that is about your global conceptual framework, how this international globalization or international sovereignism is supposed to interact with the nuclear power that believe in Westphalian sovereignty.
Well, I'm not sure it does. You know, Westphalian sovereignty is, if you like, version 1 of the system. We're now in version 5. If you know, my charter system building the ones we mentioned earlier. In the European context, I must stress this, because of course China and India have their own patterns of interaction, and the other systems and African systems and Latin America, of course, are something else. But of course, the nuclear age is, it's the shadow which frames it all. So sovereign internationalism is certainly reinforced by the nuclear age, because the stark power which nuclear weapons provide. And of course, it's a deterrent. But the tragedy today is that states are, and I'm thinking of the political West, and above all, the United Kingdom, are behaving as if the nuclear deterrence no longer matters. Hence the pushing without restraint, to use Nikolai's term, pushing and pushing and pushing. And they did so before 2014, as if, you know, against Russia's stated, and even William Burns, head of the CIA, in his famous book, you know, the back channel, he talks about, you know, in Russia, the elite was united, and has been since the 1990s, opposed to NATO enlargement in its unmediated form. So even then it was a suggestion that you know, nuclear weapons, well, we can ignore it. Well, of course we can't. And so I don't see this contradiction, that sovereign internationalism in the nuclear age is even more essential. And in fact, it's those democratic internationalists which are more dangerous, because they erode the power of nuclear weapons to act as a deterrent. Thank you.
Nikolai or Paul, is there anything you would like to wait on here, please?
Yeah, I was listening carefully to what Richard said, and especially his optimistic words about tempered liberalism. They reminded me of Gandhi's famous phrase, Western civilization, what a wonderful idea. Multiple modernities, as Richard points out, Stuart Eisenstadt had a wonderful insight, namely that modernity has many more progenitors than just the West. And therefore, by logical extension, so do democracy and liberalism. They have Indian roots, they have Chinese roots, they have Muslim roots, they have, in addition to the distinctive characteristics of both of these that are expressed in the Judeo-Christian tradition that we're most familiar with. I fully agree with Richard. It would be foolhardy to abandon existing structures that keep a lid willy-nilly on the problems that we have without an alternative in place. But meanwhile, it is already high time to fill those alternatives with substance and begin to think about encouraging Western nations to join these alternative structures. Why would they do so? Because I'm not at all convinced that the Western rhetoric about being the most dynamic, the most progressive, the most insightful, and the most productive region of the world, this tiny peninsula on the Eurasian continent, is actually likely in the future to be more dynamic than a Russo-Sino-Indic order, which seems to me to have implicitly the ability to combine the best of many cultures and to be cross-cultural itself. Russia bleeding into Europe, China being an ancient civilization in its own right, and India as well, but also with interesting connections to Anglo-Saxon thought. So that's what I would say. I wouldn't put all my cards in the Western, eggs in the Western basket. I find Richard's suggestion about relying more heavily on the deeper cultural West to not be very satisfying. Let me tell you why. What institutions does this deeper cultural West currently inhabit? And what political influence do they have? What I have seen since 2014, and especially since 2022, is the institutions of what Richard rightly calls the political West obliterating those cultural interactions and obliterating any efforts by the deeper cultural West to reconnect and build contacts with Russian European culture on its own. And I simply don't see them having the ability to counteract the political West meaningfully, unfortunately.
Thank you, Nicolas. Paul, did you wanted to add something?
Just very briefly, I'm afraid I'd rather agree with Nikolai's points. I agree with Richard's. I was very excited by Richard's point on a theoretical level about the process of retrieval of the best of the West, rather than simply rejecting the West. It's fascinating to me the extent to which debate about this is taking place in Russia today, among thoughtful intellectuals and sometimes not so thoughtful intellectuals in Russia, about whether should we reject the West? Should the West is fighting against us? Should we just build a Russia that just completely turns its back on the West? Versus others who are saying that, well, which West are we referring to? So it's exactly the question that Richard is raising, and it's very much in the spirit of Simone Weil. I mean, if you look at her books and her readings of French history, and she's extraordinarily critical of France at many points, but you can tell that it's never a destructive impetus when she reads history. History is absolutely essential to her understanding of how to form of the good in even in sort of an internal and metaphysical sense, is that it has to be informed by history, which means that she's always searching for what is inspiring in the past. What can we find in our past that we absolutely have to hold on to. So I completely agree with you, Richard, in that methodological sense, but I also completely agree with Nikolai's point that he's just made, that there is no institutional home for that part of our past in the West. Not only is there not a home, but there seems to be an active campaign to make sure that there cannot be a home, which is for it, and that which was a point that I was trying to make when I initially framed my few comments about the absence of any intrinsic order of limit. The idea of limit is absent from our sort of this, for brevity's sake, called neocon, power, political, foreign policy, institutional order. The idea of limit is absent from it. But it's also our ideational order doesn't have the idea of limit either. There's an instrumentalization of values, so that like everyone talks endlessly. It's become tedious to complain about wokeism and so forth. But the problem with it is that these fashionable new values are themselves instruments. They're not even values. They're just themselves political instruments. It's like the instrumentalization of instruments. So how do you build on something that's so divorced from reality, which is the final point that I wanted to make, Richard, because I think it's absolutely crucial point that you make about the West simply pretending that nuclear threats don't exist anymore. And this harks back to some conversations that we've had through the Simone Weil Center a year ago, when we were talking about the divorce from reality that seems to have overcome the West, which I think that there's just this living in a world which is itself manufactured into narratives which allow the continuation of various efficiencies and productions and profit centers, but it has nothing to do really with reality, because nuclear weapons are a reality, but we pretend they don't exist because it doesn't fit into our narrative, and the narratives don't have any limits to them. So this in another discussion some other day, I think it would be interesting to get into the self-destruction of the ideational foundation of the West, and how Kant figures into all of this, because there seems like a decay of Kant in Kantian ideas and liberalism in the West, but there's also a rejection of everything that was sound in Kant in our behavior in the West. I'm just thinking about his principles of perpetual peace, completely and utterly ignored by Western behavior. So anyway, that might be going too far afield, but I agree with both of you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Richard, we still have some time for some questions, and one of them is about your vision of the role of think tanks and experts in the West and their kind of typologization of the Russian regime. How do you think they have contributed to the lost peace, and if their role is similar to what happened in the first Cold War?
Yeah. Sadly, think tanks do far too little thinking, and they rely far too much on tanks. So it's no, I mean, Glenn Deason has an excellent book out on think tanks, and he certainly excoriates some of the leading ones. And basically, if you take a Gramscian view, these are just part of the organic forms of intellectuals servicing the military-industrial complex and providing the ideational cover for the political West. I've got very little time. I mean, I think that obviously there are certain institutions which are very important, where some genuine thought is taking place. I mean, obviously, your center at George Washington University, our Simone Weil Center, and of course plenty of others, but one which I think is important because it's taking a stand, and that is the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, because its underlying vision there is the one articulated earlier by Anatole Lieven, but others as well, of ethical realism, that we live in a world, but choices must be tempered by ethical considerations and indeed tinged by the understanding of the tragic nature of politics itself, that good purposes can lead to bad outcomes, and therefore that restraint of which Paul, and I'm sorry I misattributed it earlier, Paul's culture of restraint, which you're suggesting should be incorporated. So so there are, it's a huge network. Obviously, those think tanks which are, used as instruments, it's a degradation of analysis, and I'm afraid that in that chorus there's just a few voices standing up. Can I go back to the earlier points, just to say that that discussion we've just had, thanks for both your comments, is on civilizational civilization standards. What this does do, it means that our focus on post-Cold War, post-war issues has to, we have to have a longer historical perspective. And this comes out now, and this is why if I talk of the historical West emerging 3, 4, or maybe 500 years ago, as the Russians would say, this civilizational West was, that this is the one that has set up that model of modernity, of Western modernity. But within it, of course, it was this age of slavery, colonialism, exploitation, global exploitation, amidst all of its great achievements, glittering achievements, and in part, the two are connected. But what we're now seeing is a moment of reckoning, and I agree completely that the political West is an exhausted social, ideological, and political formation. It's exhausted, and it's even becoming, it's exhausted intellectually. Even simply can no longer manage its own affairs. And by that I mean is that it has so gutted those institutions of modernity which it had been so important in establishing. For example, in high modernity, the role of the press, the media, was, however much, it became the yellow press from the 1890s, there was still a vision of, of truth. I remember looking at a newspaper called The Scotsman, and its reflection of the 1905 Russian Revolution. So, I went to to Hendon, where we have our newspaper library, in London, and going through those old copies. It was amazing. 1905, you would have these huge long articles. They seem to have nothing else to do. Tens of thousands of words dealing with issues of cattle breeding in the Highlands, but written in an extraordinarily informed and classical manner. Well, where's that gone? That high modernity, and Russia, of course. And this is another of those points which both Paul and Nikolai alluded to. It's not repudiating modernity, it's appealing to that high modernity which was once represented by the West. So it's not repudiating modernity in any shape or form. Of course, today Russia has emerged as a conservative, authoritarian political formation, in part because of the geopolitical conditions in the post-war years in which it's found itself. But they're still, as Paul very clearly shows, and Marlene, your work now shows those endless debates and enormous amount of, and of course Nikolai, it's all that there's still a public sphere in which those classical debates of high modernity are taking place. Of course, it's not as open as we would like. It's not as engaged with international academic life as we would like. But, the idea that Russia should be wholesale cancelled is, of course, anathema to us. What this civilizational West did over the last 400 years was set the standard of civilization, that classic liberal imperial element, the standard of civilization notion, which was so contested during the epoch of decolonization, after 1989, paradoxically, was reinforced. So that political West and its universalism, its false universalism, tried to say, this is the standard of civilization. Hillary Clinton was one of the most ardent exponents of it, in which she then smuggled all sorts of specific US concerns and made them in terms of gender issues and race issues, and by totally ignoring class issues, of course. And that particular way of formulating civilizational standards was then imposed on the rest of the world. Yep. So clearly Europe is, we've seen this in later statistics on the German economy and the low quality of the European political elites. There's not much source of debate. And so I must say that it seems, I've been doing quite a lot of talking to people in the United States. There's still a far more lively intellectual culture. I mean, there's plenty of people in the UK as well, but it's certainly, so just my final point then would be, who, both of you say, who is the institution? Who are the actors? Who is the agent for this renewal of Western modernity, if you want to put it that way? Well, first of all, we intellectuals, yes, I'm bold as that. Plus, in the old days, in the days of socialist challenge, people would then appeal, well, it would be trade unions, the working class. And of course, that was a they still have a part to play, but organized labor has a part to play. But just the idea of the sort of agent-centered. But you change ideas and you can change society. And I was going to say, and I realize how weak it is, but I will say it. This idea of common sense, common humanity, and unfortunately, sense is not very common nowadays, and neither is humanity. But I go about up and down the land. I mean, I was just last week we just had a marvelous. I'm sorry to give local examples, but at the in a little coastal town here locally, Whitstable, the Whitstable Labour Party Club, and there was a meeting of about 30 people there discussing Asa Winstanley's marvelous book on the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and that was a particular scandal in the Labour Party, which led to effectively the overthrow of Jeremy Corbyn as leader, whatever you may think of him. But still, it was extraordinarily, a vibrant sense of a political community that exists in opposition and understands perfectly well those failures and contradictions of the political West, also is deeply opposed to the militarism which has been deeply embedded. It was this, it's always been there, but then it was given this modern form in the first Cold War, and then became rampant in the second Cold War. You're quite right, of course. Where are the movements? What institutions? Well, it's maybe individual voices will gradually come together to establish a choir in opposition to the din and the noise of the militarist establishment.
Amen.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful conclusion,
Richard.
And it's a hopeful one, and a kind of a good one that also allows us to have a look at the conflict, not to be discussing the concrete aspect of the conflict and the battlefield and all these tensions, but also taking distance. And I think that's what is wonderful with the discussion we're having, is that we begin by discussing Russia, but we are discussing the West, right? We are discussing the West identity and the West's own challenges through discussing Russia's place in the world. So I think that was a wonderful kind of intellectual discussion, and I'm really enjoying it, enjoyed it very much, and hope we can continue that discussion later in other formats. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Nikolai and Paul, for your great comment, and Richard, thank you so much for the book, and congratulations again for one more book, but it's really a absolutely vital one. Thank you so much all, and hope to see you soon in other events.